During the 1860s, a few visionary women and men began to question women's limited opportunities and their complete legal dependence on men. By the turn of the century, some significant gains had been won. Women could keep their own property when they married, and a few girls' schools and colleges had been set up. Women ratepayers could even vote in local elections and become county councillors. But in the eyes of Millicent Fawcett, women could never achieve full equality until they had the parliamentary vote. Mrs. Fawcett and her suffragists led a sustained campaign. In 1903, a new group arrived on the scene, the suffragettes. Impatient with the genteel tactics of Mrs. Fawcett's suffragists, they called for militant action. Led by the charismatic Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffragettes devised colourful protests demanding votes for women, deliberately breaking the law in order to gain maximum publicity.
I went on holiday to Dunoon with my mother and my prospective stepfather, and as we walked down the parade, I saw a woman standing on a chair with a crowd around her, and I went over to listen to her. She was talking about the things I thought were important, at least that I knew were important. I may not have thought of them before. She was talking about equality and liberty and fair deals for people and second-class citizens. I don't know who she was, and I never met her again, but she altered the whole of my life that day.
I thought that women should have the same rights as men, and it was a woman's life, and she should say what she wanted, whether it was at Parliament or where it was. A woman should have the same say as a man. Several of us that were in the votes for women, we used to get in Hanley Market Square and spout a bit. But in those days the police would, if they got a bit too rowdy, the police would come and move us off. But we still used to say what we thought.
We only split, you see, when they became destructive of property and violent with other people. I mean, as long as it was only they themselves, we could stick together. But we thought it was stupid to challenge men on the only ground in which it's absolutely obvious that we're inferior, and that's in physical strength. But we admired their self-sacrifice tremendously, and Dame Millicent Fawcett would never criticize. She was asked to condemn the violence, and she always said to the men, "It's your fault. We've asked that as ladies for 50 years and you've paid no attention. And now this is what's happened, not our fault, yours."
The whole purpose of militancy was to hit property and not persons. The only people who were ever injured in the suffragette movement were the suffragettes themselves, who did have to bear a great deal a very brutal knocking about and torture in prison. But we did not do anything to harm people. What we were setting out to do was to harm property. Therefore window smashing, therefore acid on golf greens, which was a terrible shock for a Prime Minister who'd come to play around in the morning and found votes for women all over the first green. We attempted to do a variety of setting things on fire. They were not always successful, but they always got very strong publicity. And we were aiming at convincing people that unless something was honestly done to meet our demands, that it was going to be very uncomfortable for people who own property.
The forcible feeding process was really extremely unpleasant. But some people managed to put up with it literally for months, which meant hundreds of times. Well, they push a tube up the nostril, which goes wriggling down into the stomach. Then there's a funnel on the end of the tube. They pour the food in, you see. But I was determined to stop them if I could. And all the time they were trying to push this very tube down, I kept up coughing, coughing and coughing and coughing without stopping, kept it up incessantly. Well, they kept on trying, and after a bit I suppose they thought they'd succeeded. They poured food in. I didn't see because I always kept my eyes shut on these unpleasant occasions. And they went away thinking they'd finished, I suppose. But in almost no time, intense pains, not little bits of ones, but intense pains came all round my chest, and I could not breathe. Well, I didn't know what was the matter, but I understood it was double pneumonia and pleurisy, due to food getting into the lung, which might easily have happened because of the way I kept up this perpetual coughing, causing things to go the wrong way and all the rest of it.
They broke the press boycott. The press had been told not to give any publicity to the movement. Well, of course, when you burn down something, the press is certainly going to pay attention to you. So they were extremely valuable in that way. They wouldn't have succeeded in at all, I'm sure, without the enormous amount of educational work we'd put in. You see, people were ready, especially the women, were ready to accept the new idea. And then after the war, Asquith could climb down without loss of faith by saying in the House that, of course, votes were given to women as a reward for the admirable service they'd done during the war.
How much were the different elements in the suffrage movement at odds with each other? How much did they disagree?
Well, they disagreed on election policy. As was made clear in the film, you see, the militant society was opposing the government. They said, we're tired of private members' bills, private members can't do anything. We must attack the government, whether the members of the government are friendly or not. It's the government we must attack. And of course, Mr. Asquith was the arch enemy.
Next question, please.
If you are elected, will you do your best to make women's suffrage a government measure?
May we have the next question, please?
But you haven't answered our question.
If you are elected, will you do your best to make women's suffrage a government measure?
Gentlemen at the back of the hall, downstairs.
If you are elected, will you do your best to make women's suffrage a government measure?
years of failure to win the vote had then passed, and I saw that we must adopt a new policy. This would need a new society, of course, and Mother and I had already formed the Women's Social and Political Union. The new policy was to ignore private members of Parliament and rely no longer on their pledges, but hold the government entirely responsible for giving votes to women, and to harass them until they did so. This new policy was first put into effect at the famous Free Trade Hall meeting, to which I went with Annie Kenney to ask two speakers who were prospective members of the incoming Liberal government this question: will your government give women the vote? Before I left to go to this meeting, I said to Mother, I shall be in prison tonight, and she did not discourage me. Our question to the two speakers was not answered, but the meeting was in uproar, and the stewards ejected us. Outside the hall, we staged a demonstration necessary to ensure our arrest. Next day, we were sentenced to fine or prison. We chose prison.
When militancy developed into real sabotage, such as we saw, for instance, on the screen, I think then it did harm. I think it did. But I think the early stages of militancy didn't. I think after all, Christabel Pankhurst's exploit at the Free Trade Hall in 1905, she was the first person, I think, to go to prison, and the later prisoners did stir a tremendous amount of enthusiasm among women, and I'm inclined to think at that time that the constitutional movement under Mrs. Fawcett was in a sense for a time parasitic on the militant movement, which worked up tremendous enthusiasm among women, and then their reason told them to go and join the constitutionals.
You see, the problem they faced was that the constitutionals had worked from 1870 to 90 and got very hardly anywhere.
It was absolutely true, and Mrs. Fawcett recognized it when that affair happened at the Free Trade Hall. She said, we've worked for how many years, I don't know how many, and now at last we're in the news.
Lady Ascot, what attitude did your father, as Prime Minister, take to the suffrage movement before militancy came along?
I can't pretend that he was an ardent woman suffragist. I don't know quite what it was that inhibited him. I, of course, was at the receiving end of the suffragettes. I mean, I saw it as a close-up. And I was involved physically.
There was one occasion when you fought them off, wasn't there?
More than one, far more. I constantly had to intervene when they made savage assaults on my father. And I think I'm not, perhaps, a natural pugilist. And I remember quite well, once we were peacefully playing golf together on the links at Lossiemouth, Ramsay MacDonald's home. And I suddenly looked up from my putting and saw my father being savaged by two women who looked quite maniacal, and I closed with them. That they were trying to tear his clothes off, and he was standing rather foursquare on the putting green, holding on to the lapels of his coat like grim death. But I mean, that kind of situation was constantly arising. I must frankly confess that voteless women were not to me the most urgent or the most clamant need of the day. I was far more harrowed by this stark contrast between poverty and affluence. And I think what people forget about that time is that the franchise was very, very selective, limited and discriminating.
Even
and
for men.
Property was the main qualification, and that the women who most needed help wouldn't have got the vote. And to me it seemed every bit as unjust to disqualify to disfranchise someone on account of their poverty, as to disqualify them on account of their sex.
Oh, we
thousands of men lost their lives in France, the women were called on at home to volunteer for service too. They did heavy, dirty and physically dangerous jobs, which would have been unthinkable before the war. Many had their first taste of their own pay packet and found they liked it. Mrs. Pankhurst abandoned her campaign for women's rights and threw herself into the recruiting effort. Her suffragette movement folded in an orgy of patriotism. But Mrs. Fawcett's suffragists, whilst supporting the war, even sending nursing units to the front line, continued to press for the vote. In January 1918, their tireless efforts over 50 years were finally rewarded.
I wasn't so nervous because I felt that I hadn't got there in any merit of my own, but the women of England had fought, bled and died for the vote. So I felt that I couldn't represent myself. I was represent myself something bigger than myself.
What were the reactions of all the women who had fought so long, the reactions when an American suddenly arrived?
I really honestly wished it had been an English-born woman, and I'm a Virginian. And I kept thinking, well, I wouldn't like it if I were in Virginia and an English woman came and entered their house. But they were perfectly splendid. I've never known such loyalty. To see that, because, mind you, I always never did a thing without asking Mrs. Fawcett and Mrs. Pankhurst and the women who'd fought for the vote. I knew I was there to represent them. And when they saw that, they were loyal to me in an amazing degree.
How did the members react to your presence?
They didn't really want a woman in the house, and that was natural. But in the words of Henry James, they behave with the dauntless decency of the British people, and they were quite remarkable. You see, it was so embarrassing for them to have a woman about. It's like Winston Churchill said, after I'd been there about 2 years, I met him at dinner, and I'd known him very well. He'd been in Clifton for a long time. He said, "My dear Nancy, I congratulate you." And I said, "What on?" He said, "Being there for 2 years." I said, "Well, Winston, why didn't you speak to me? Why did none of you speak to me?" And he said, "Well, we hoped to freeze you out, and then we'd get no more like you." And then he made this wonderful remark. He said, "When you entered the House of Commons, I felt as though a woman had entered my bathroom and I'd nothing to protect myself with except the sponge."
See it.